I want to talk to you about buying time in riparian areas and trying to think about adaptation. And adaptation's not necessarily my thing. My truck has got 285,000 miles on it. My car's got 150,000 miles on it. My favorite TV show is Antique Roadshow. But we have to learn to adapt. And the only person I know with older truck than mine is Courtney, and he asked me to do this. So, wherever Courtney is. I think that I've earned a little bit of right to be here, though. I've been working on projects through my second career, which started about 18 years ago after I retired from the Forest Service. I've done about 280 stream and wetland restoration projects around the Southwest, and not all of them been totally successful, but there's been a lot that I've learned along the way, and I hope some of those ideas might give us a clue on adapting for climate change. It's a little bit difficult to know where restoration ends, which is what I thought I was doing all this time, was stream and wetland restoration. And where does building resilience in the face of adaptation begin, and where does adaptation begin? Some people say building resilience is just restoration, a little higher caliber restoration. So I don't know if we know how to define adaptation on the ground, and we haven't certainly had the experience know what works and what doesn't work in the face of climate change. So we may have some false starts, but I think some of the things that me and my cohorts have been doing for the last 15 to 18 years might be of some guidance. So climate change is not theoretical, it's real. My wife Mary is here, and I was working with Steve Reichert one day on a project down this creek, and we finished up a little early, and Mary and I have been looking to buy a piece of land for 4 years and never quite found the right place, and drove up the canyon, and there was a for sale sign on the gate, and called up Mary, and I said, I don't think we'd like it, but we should look at it, right? So we decided we really did love it, and we bought this little piece of land, and we built a house where we could look down at the creek and the wetlands along the creek bank, and had a little hay field, and we even had some beavers, and one beaver was kind enough to build a pond about 700 feet long, big enough for my canoe and the dog. And so we began to face the changes brought about by climate change, and realize that they're real and they're deeply personal. It's going to change our lives. We all need to get used to that idea. We had 9 species of ducks. We had nesting Canada geese and mallards, and we had 3 species of fish only, but one of them was creek chubs, and it was a very high-density population, and it supported nesting great blue herons and black-crowned night herons and kingfishers and muskrats and quite a few different species in the wetland and in the creek. And then we had an annual hay crop that helped to buy fencing material to put fence around the riparian and so forth. And then last year, 2012, we had a drought, and our perennial creek dried up for 4 months, and beavers moved out, and well, we still had the dams, so maybe if we got a little bit of rain and we'd still have water. But then this summer we had I think in September, 7 inches of rain in 9 days or some such statistic, and all the beaver dams blew out. So I don't know when those 9 species of ducks will be back. And we lost a hay crop, and because the beaver dams used to sub-irrigate the first terrace. So even when the acequia ditch didn't flow, we still had some moisture in to grow the hay crop. But this summer, the hay crop was not doing so well, and the elk up on the mountain didn't have any green feed, so they came down in the bottom and they kind of pruned the hayfield down pretty tight. So there's so many different ramifications, both economic and personal in climate change, that we need to take it and think about what those implications are. And maybe someday we'll have the herons and the leopard frogs and the geese back. I like to think of restoration efforts, and then by implication adaptation to climate change, being understanding the 3 interactive processes out there on the ground, that the increase in any one or decrease in any one of these 3 major drivers, the hydrology of the system, the ecology of the system, and the geomorphology of the system, to interact. So if one is diminished, the other 2 are diminished also, or have a different set of effects. So I've been involved in riparian restoration for a long time, and we've focused on planting cottonwood trees and willows, or killing salt cedar and Russian olive. And there's a whole lot more to river and riparian restoration than that. If you don't understand how a change in the ecology is going to change the geomorphology of the stream banks, or the way the sediments deposited on the wetland surface, and affects the way that the flows from what rains we have run off the land, and then you don't understand how the system works, and whatever you do, if it succeeds, it's going to be luck, not good management. So that, to me, always gets less attention than it ought to. Any change in any of those 3 major concepts affects the other 2. You have to think of them as a product. And so what does hotter and drier mean in terms of how the hydrology, geomorphology, and the ecology of the system going to interact? Climate change means a lot of things to a lot of people. The National Wildlife Federation put together a booklet called Climate Smart Conservation. They said manage for change, not just persistence. And that's what we've always done in conservation, is try to save what's left and restore missing species. But they said we have to change and focus on sustaining the ecological functions on the landscape, whether or not we can save a particular assemblage of plants and animals. So that's how those 3 major drivers interact. Yesterday, Jim Overpeck gave a summary on the impacts of climate change on the Southwest, what it's going to mean. We can look at an increase in drought severity, longer, worse droughts. We can look for an increase in flooding intensities across the landscape. We can look for earlier snowmelt and changes in the timing of stream flow, and therefore changes in the sediments that the stream will be carried and where the stream will put them. We can look for change in extremes in daily precipitation, and we can look for a decrease in average precipitation, and so on down the line. I feel like we can interact with the ones down in this list down to average annual precipitation. And we can interact in how we manage the riparian area. And and take some guidance from this. Because if we're going to have increased drought severity and longer droughts, but we're also going to have increase in flooding, then where can we store the water that comes our way during those flood events and use it to prepare in some way for the impact of the next drought? And how do we think about things like where our major flow events come from? Some of our watersheds are snowmelt driven. When the snow melts in the spring of the year, that's the major pulse of water flow in that system. And the water that keeps the stream going has to come from base flow, that water stored in the banks after the snow melt's over. On the other hand, some of our systems are monsoon driven. We don't have any significant snow melt because it's mesa country, or it's not high enough elevation, or it's too far south. And so in order to make maximum use of those stream flows over time, we have to work with the flows that occur as a result of the monsoons. We can't count on snow melt. Some stream systems have a little bit of both. I think we can maybe be able to make more progress trying to deal with the monsoon aspect of it rather than the snow melt. But of course, if you got a ranch that's in the high country, you're going to depend on the snow melt. If you're in low country, you're going to depend on monsoon events. So anyway, I've been thinking that maybe we should focus our efforts on those places that are where we have some assurance of either having the snow melt or the monsoon event, because there's lots of places to devote our attention out there on the landscape. So this is an example of an alluvial fan for Mayhew Park Ranch. This is a snow melt driven system. And there's been work done on studies in Colorado up around Estes Park where they've shown that the major source of water for the slope wetlands and for stream flow comes from water stored in the alluvial fan. Well, hydrology is basically, when the precipitation occurs. What's the timing from a seasonal standpoint? What's the frequency of storm events? What's the magnitude of events? And that determines the magnitude of flow in streams or as hill slope runoff or across the valley. What's the duration of a flow event? And in the ecology, we think of species diversity, we think of growth forms, we think of how they're adapted to the environment locally. We talk about community interactions between not only the plants, but the animals that depend on them, their effects on the thickness and density of the grass mat. How does that affect runoff, and how does that affect where sediments are deposited on the land surface? And we think about the potential for genetic change over time and for that plant community or animal community to adapt to new stresses. And do they stay there and adapt, or do they migrate upslope or somewhere else where the climate is still to their liking? And then the geomorphology is what's the landform? What's the stream channel dimensions and slope? And what are the materials that make up the stream bank? And how much power does the stream have when it's flowing at a normal flood rather than a 100-year flood or something like that, but a 2-year flood, a frequent flood? And how do the particles move, and where do they come from, and where in the water column are they transported, and where are they deposited? And we can influence that by where the vegetation is And we have to know that that's going to be directed by the hydrology, the timing, frequency, magnitude, duration of the storm. So we have to do, when we do a plan for restoration or adaptation to climate change, we have to think about the interaction of all these forces. What do we usually do? We go out there and plant a bunch of willows on the stream bank and think we've dealt with restoration or adaptation. I'm not against planting willows, but I hope that our thought and our thinking can be a lot deeper than that. And our pushing the creek around with a bulldozer may solve some immediate problem, but it may create a lot of long-range problems that are not well adapted or not adaptable to climate change. I want to talk a little bit about 3 different projects, areas, and case studies that I've been involved in. This is a Hubble trading post, which is a national historic site managed by the Park Service in the town of Ganado, Arizona, which is within the Navajo Reservation. It was originally established as a trading post in the 1870s by Mr. Hubble. Another project I want to talk about is Seboya Canyon. Seboya Canyon is near Grants, New Mexico. It's above the El Malpais, which lava flow. The most recent event there was about 2,000 years ago. It's one of the youngest lava flows in the continental U.S. The stream was cut off by those gravel lava flows, and so now it's a closed basin. It doesn't interact with the Rio San Jose any longer. That canyon was kind of a haven for refugees from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. There was a community sprung up there of about 200 people, a natural wetland to grow carrots and cabbage and late summer crops. And when the war started, people either went off to serve in the armed forces or moved away to work in the war plants, and the community was abandoned, and it was bought up for ranching, and it was heavily ranched for 50 years, and then traded to the BLM in the land exchange, so it's now publicly owned. And I want to talk a little bit about Canyon Bonito Ranch, belonging to Mike Reardon and his family. They're near the town of Wagon Mound, New Mexico. These were chosen because they represent different ecological conditions, different precipitation patterns, and each is, we've done uniquely different restoration treatments, which should have implications for climate adaptation. So there's 2 opportunities to store water easily. And it's either on the floodplain when the stream is in flow. This is a very stable stream with what would be called a Rosganee channel. I know very few of you are trained in that, but that's when a stream is in flood stage on about a 2-year interval, that water will fill that narrow winding channel and spill out onto the floodplain. The floodplain is very wide relative to the width of the creek. There's other streams that the stream is wider and the floodplain is narrower, so that this is not the only kind of stream with a floodplain, but this is the easiest to understand. When the water spills out across the floodplain, it slows down. The water over the channel itself is still moving at a higher velocity, but the water that's spilled out onto the floodplain suddenly slows way down. There's a lot of roughness, as a geomorphologist would call it, and the water's trickling between the plants, and when it slows down, it starts to drop what's called the wash load, the silt and clay particles that are in suspension in the water flow. And they wouldn't fall out if it weren't for the vegetation growing on the stream bank, or it would flow out. The small particles would spill out at a much lesser rate. And then those plants grow up between those particles and bind them in place and build a wide, flat floodplain that's accessible to the next flood. Okay, and while that water is there, gravity is tugging on it and it's pulling it down into the soil. We have infiltration and percolation into the lower strata in the floodplain. So the more often we could get water on the floodplain, and the longer it could tarry there as the flood goes on, will influence how much water can be stored in the stream bank. Stream bank storage, that water moves slowly. If you're a scientist, you might call it hyporheic flow, which means under the roots, and move on down the channel, okay? Tie that back to adaptation. If we're going to have longer droughts and we're going to have quick, intense storms, where's a better place to try to store some water? Where's a better place to try to keep the plant community alive than that zone? Maybe other places, but this might be top priority of where you want to spend your first dollar to reconnect the stream with its floodplain. Okay, the other situation is the alluvial fan. And this one's up by the Vidal area. And an alluvial fan occurs when water flows down a steep drainage and hits a flatter area, such as adjacent to the main stream channel. And when the land surface suddenly gets flatter, the water slows down because gravity drives the velocity of the flow. So when it slows down, it can't carry the sediment load. It might be coarse particles. It spreads out across the land available to it, drops the coarse particles, and that's very porous, so the water can seep into that sponge and across the whole expanse of the sponge, and that water is available to species of vegetation adapted to it. Those plants utilize that water, create a special habitat. More importantly, we're going to hear talk about trout fisheries in the West and the effects of climate change on those fisheries. That water is available to seep out of the alluvial fan as base flow and keep the downstream stream flowing. So where's a better place to try to store water, okay, than an alluvial fan? There might be other places, but these are kind of made to order. And alluvial fans, in my opinion, are almost uniformly desecrated across the Southwest from roads that cross them at peculiar angles and channel the water away, or long-term trailing from season-long grazing management programs that the water tank is at one end of the valley and the grass is at the other, so the cows go back and forth day after day in the same track and create corridors for the water to follow across the alluvial fan so it can't spread out and soak into the fan. So anyway, these are two areas. There's lots of other things we can do. Well, I'm trying to base this talk on a kind of maybe a no-brainer way to select the places that we could focus our efforts, not really knowing what climate change is going to mean in the long run. This might be our best chance to be successful, and it's a no-regret strategy. If we can make these areas more productive, even if there's nothing to it, if climate change is all a farce and it's never going to happen, at least we've fixed those areas anyhow. We haven't lost anything. So here's a damaged floodplain on the left, damaged by an old wagon road from a logging camp on the Vidal that goes way back to when that was privately owned, and people traveled up and down this meadow every day to cut timber and haul it to the sawmill, which is out of sight down canyon down here. There's a little bitty green area to the right of the gully, and that's about 1.5 feet wide, and that's very sinuous, and that's where the old stream channel used to be. And this gully is where the water is now. So there's no significant water being stored in that soil column, because the bottom of the gully is down there 12 feet deep or 15 feet deep, and the water goes laterally out to the creek and then flows down the creek. It can't spill across the landform during a flood event. It can't get there. So that's wasted space when it comes to saving water to adapt to climate change. And the other shot in the lower right is a damaged alluvial fan where the effects of trailing can be seen, and the water doesn't spread across the surface of the alluvial fan. And the water runs faster in the gully than it does on the fan surface, so it has more erosive power, so the channel gets deeper and deeper over time, and less water can be stored. So where can we store water? We can store water in the banks. Well, obviously we're not storing any water in that lower right-hand shot, but that's the only place I can show you what the strata look like in a stream bed. And when a stream builds its banks over time, it stores the coarsest particles at the bottom and mid-sized particles by size in the middle and the finest particles on top. And when there's a flood, the water can move by gravity easily through the porous coarse particles and much more slowly in the fine particles on top. But being in touch with having the fine particles in touch with the coarse ones, the water can wick up by capillary action, and there's water available to the vegetation that's growing on the land surface. So the vegetation stays vigorous and ready to catch the fine particles out of the next flood and so forth. So whenever the stream down cuts, such as it's doing on the right side, and the stream banks get higher, less and less of the bank is in contact with the next flood, so the water can't move into that porous layer as freely as it used to. So that becomes unavailable for water storage. So these things are all synergistic, and they get worse with time unless there's a principle in hydrology that the stream will downcut to some stabilizing grade control feature like bedrock, and then widen and make more room for itself. And as it gets wider, it has less power, and then we start getting new deposition, and the stream will begin to build itself back up and have the same sinuosity and slope as it did before it was damaged. But the river's in no hurry, and if it takes 100 years or 200 years or 500 years for that to occur, that's okay to the river, but it might not be okay to us. So in the meantime, we've lost the opportunity to store that much water. Okay, so here's water being stored in an alluvial fan as a sponge, and we've been doing some things to get the water out of the cattle trail and back onto the land surface. This was a Quivira project on the Vidal Spring Wagon Creek, which is a tributary to Comanche Creek. This was a project in August of this year. So 5 ways to build resilience in riparian areas in the face of climate change might be these. One is to reconnect a stream with the historic stream channel segments that are been isolated because the stream became incised and cut down and floods no longer can get to the old channel segment. If we could restore access to that, which is now floodplain, we can increase the amount and rate of infiltration and bank storage. Dave Roskin calls this priority 1. It's the thing you most want to do if you have an opportunity, is reconnect the river to its abandoned channels. The next thing I think is most important is to remove what I call floodplain clutter and try to improve stream access to land surface. I've got a list of items that constitute floodplain clutter here, and I'll get to it in a little bit. The next is to raise the channel bed elevation over the length of the stream reach that you're working with in order to give access to the floodplain. And we can use a method that I developed called induced meandering. There's a book about how to do that in the bookstore. And we can also just systematically raise each of the riffle areas a given amount, and that reconnects the creek with that rocky strata where the porosity is high, and we can spread the water subsurface flow back into the floodplain. And that's not building check dams. I'm get very upset about the notion of using the word even, so I may never use it again, I hope. We don't want check dams out there. We want to raise the bed of the creek, not dam the creek up. Creek doesn't want to be a lake, it wants to be a creek. If we raise the bed of the creek from one end of a reach to the other end, then the river can behave the same way and flow at the same slope and the same speed. The only thing that's different is now it can reach its floodplain before it couldn't. We haven't impounded the water, which has head or pressure to spill over the check dam and carve out a scour pool below the dam and undercut the dam or else go around it. We haven't done that. We've just physically raised the bed of the channel from one end of the reach we're working on to the other end. So there's a process you have to follow. So another is to reestablish dispersed flow across alluvial fan surfaces to enhance infiltration and storage. And that's dealing with roads or livestock trails or game trails or whatever it may be that's funneling the water and not allowing it to spread across that flat surface. And we're always faced with the problem of gullies or head cutting moving up through these desirable landforms. We want to prevent gully proliferation as top priority. Save the flood. Excuse me. So at Hubble Trading Post, I started a project there with the cooperation and goodwill and great assistance of the park superintendent at that time, Nancy Stone. And we went out and looked at the creek, and it was down cut about 12 feet. I'll show another picture in a minute. It was down cut 12 feet and was about 16 feet wide. It had been straightened with a excavator, had no sinuosity, and whenever there was a flood, the water roared down that narrow, deep channel and cut the creek ever deeper. And that's where I first used the induced meandering concept to put the wiggle back in the creek using structures designed mathematically to certain sizes and certain spacing, and direct that power of the flowing water into the bank rather than into the bed. So the creek quit getting deeper and started to get wider, okay? And that is heresy. You don't deliberately cause a stream bank to erode. Are you crazy? But it is what the river would do over time. So why not just speed up the process? So Nancy was quite open and willing to give it a try on a test basis, and we worked with a half-a-mile reach of the river and put the wiggle back. And then putting the wiggle back in a half-a-mile reach, 2,600 feet long, we, over the course of, 17 years now, have added 500 feet to the length of the river within that area. The stream width went from 12 feet wide to 28 feet wide. No, 30 feet. I predicted 28 and it went to 30. Okay. And there had been no floodplain in the past. Now the floodplain is 120 feet wide. And so there's been a lot of changes just by putting the wiggle back in the river using the induced meandering technique. So you can see the difference in the scoured look of the stream bank in the left here in 1998 and the healthy vegetated view on the right. So this is how the structures are placed in induced meandering. You have baffles indicated by the triangles, and they force the water to move to either to the left or right on a certain spacing. In the case of Hubble, those baffles were 110 feet apart. First one pushing the water to the left, and then the next one pushing the water to the right. And, or in this case, in the diagram, the water's moving from right to left. The first baffle pushes the water into the bank. It flows downstream and goes around the next baffle that pushes it to the left, and then it ricochets off that bank and goes around the next baffle and pushing it to the right. Okay. And then halfway between the baffles is where the riffle would normally form in the stream bed anyway. So we put in a low weir, either a one rock dam or drive sticks in the stream bed to kind of plant a riffle in the river bottom. So the coarse material starts to gather there, and it, after a couple of years, comes out looking like a gravelly or rocky riffle in the creek, and there'll be a pool develop under the bank, under the bend, at each bend, at first to the left and then to the right and so forth. That's how a river forms the interspersion between pools and riffles. So this just speeds up the process. So it worked. And this is another view of the same area. You can see the scoured bank. This was in May of 1998. There was a little bit of residual snowmelt flow in the creek coming off of the Fort Defiance Plateau. And this is how it looked in 2013. The stream is really narrowed down in there. There's a good accessible floodplain now, and the water can spread across the floodplain. And it's totally stocked with wetland-dependent species like three square and other streamside bulrushes, other streamside plants like that, and willows. This is how the creek looked upper left when we started the project. And lower right is how it looked after 6 years. And each time the stream would recede, we would add to the baffle, which is in the foreground here, and push the water even harder into the bank so we kept the pressure on. So you can see the vegetation start to move in, the wetland vegetation. And then this is how it looked about 2 months ago. And this is where the floodplain is now 120 feet wide. The stream bed came up 8 feet in elevation over that time because there's a lot of sand moving in the water column coming down off the Fort Defiance Plateau. So we now have, instead of an ephemeral stream, we have an ephemeral stream with perennial pools where there's a variety of frogs and 2 species of fish and used by herons and waterfowl and so forth at what was once a ditch. So we could do that anywhere to take advantage of what flows we do get under climate change, because that water can soak into the banks and move downstream very slowly rather than in one quick pulse at the end of a storm. Okay, let's go now to Seboya Canyon, the area that was the haven for Dust Bowl refugees in the 1930s. The top of that bank was where the stream flowed the year I was born. The bottom of the bank is 40 feet below that, the stream bed. That's how much the creek cut down as a result of activities in the watershed. But mostly the creek was captured by the road that the settlers used to move up and down the canyon. So here's a place where we're using the induced meandering method, a triangular shaped forest of sticks driven in the stream bed there, and you can see the result. It caused the bank to collapse at that point. Wow, that's erosion. That's why we don't want to do that. But what it does is it forces the stream pattern to become more sinuous, and the materials that wash off the cut bank side, the right side in this case, get deposited on the next downstream bar and help to build a stream bar elevation and dimensions, and that becomes a seed bed for grasses and wetland vegetation to grow, for willows to start to grow. So that changes the speed of the flow there, which affects the geomorphology of the channel and accelerates the rate of sediment deposition, and the scour on the opposite side creates a pool, a deep pool that becomes more perennial and available for animal habitat. So what's the benefit in that steep eroding slope anyway? Why don't we get on with causing it to erode so that it becomes floodplain again and can sustain plant life and animal life and forage for livestock or whatever it might be. The river would do the same thing given enough time. It would whip back and forth across the whole valley floor and sort all those sediments out and create a new floodplain. So this method just speeds up the process. Okay, so we began a project in the Seboya Canyon about 13 years ago with volunteers from the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation and Talking Talons, which is a youth group, and a few other volunteer organizations. And then in 2010, we got funded through the Public Clean Water Act funds 104, which is for wetland restoration, and came up with a more deliberate, accelerated project. The first thing to do in that was to divide the river into reaches, and a reach was an area that was similar, where the river, characteristics of the river and the characteristics of the floodplain and the vegetation growing on the floodplain and the impacts on that were similar, because we'd have a different treatment in each case. So here we had reaches 0 through 8. You say, why did you number 1, 0? Because we got additional funding and we'd already numbered everything else 1 through 8. So we cheated, went the other way. Okay. But each of these reaches has very different characteristics. And reach 0 was severely impacted by human activities, road, abandoned irrigation ditches, and so forth. I can't believe it's only 10 minutes to go. Okay, speed up here. So we had this is reach 0, and it was littered with floodplain clutter, which is old roads, abandoned irrigation ditches, buildings, road drainage ditches, road encroachment on the floodplain, culverts, bridges, berms, things like that. Anything that interferes with the sheet flow or across the floodplain, to me, is floodplain clutter. And we can remove a lot of those. Okay. So we did. We took out an old ditch bank up there that was carrying the water down the valley for about a mile in a deep, narrow gully with no floodplain, and put it back in the historic flood river bottom so that could be reconnected and store water again. The next one, this is looking downstream in the same reach. That has already half filled with sediment and vegetation in just 2 years. Okay, this is a place where we deliberately planted bulrushes to stabilize those bar surfaces so they could collect more sediment and slow the water down. This was done by volunteers. This is an area below the Seboya Springs. 15 years ago, that was a 1/4 acre beat-out stock tank. We fenced the stock tank, made water available for the livestock in a different area, and the water has spread on the land surface downstream a little bit each year. It advances in the winter when the surface is frozen, and retreats in the summer during the dry period. And then the next year, the water from the spring advances a little farther down valley, and more of it has become wetted and turned into a wetland. So it went from a 1/4 acre stock tank to 40 acres of wetland now in 15 years. This is what it looks out like from the spring looking downstream. This is a key area for lots of different kinds of wildlife, but especially sorrel rails, which are kind of rare in New Mexico. This is an area downstream from that was drained to grow carrots and cabbage, late summer crops, because this system is maintained by monsoon flow. So it gets flooded every summer. The only time you could grow a crop here was be something that you could plant towards the end of the monsoon season and make a crop by winter. So then we used what we call burrito dams. Well, what the heck is a burrito dam? A burrito dam is sandbags wrapped in a filter fabric so that the light of the sun doesn't destroy the sandbags by I can't think of the word I need. But anyway, gradually spreading the water across that surface. So this was a different kind of surface, a different kind of treatment. This is a project in Colorado where we used a media luna, a 1 rock deep layer of rock spread across the meadow to spread the water from a spring out across the meadow surface. Transformed that area in 1 year from a again, I'm stuck for word, but a weed patch into a productive wetland. Okay, this is showing the use of media lunas or arcing 1 rock deep structures on Quivira's Red Canyon Reserve down in Socorro County. This is Chihuahua Desert, so we're relying on monsoon flow to reestablish the vegetation in that area. Back to Seboya. In this case, this is reach 5. It's the best reference reach. Is most like the natural conditions that spread the water from bank to bank. We just had the flow in September. The water here, where there's no channel or very little channel at all, just sheet flow across that whole surface, the water was 2.5 feet deep from hill slope to hill slope with no damage to the land surface. Now, we got 2 deeply eroding areas on an alluvial fan there, and those are spilling sediment into the main valley, and that's damming up a gully that's in the vicinity of that thick stand of trees right there. So that's helping to heal the valley at the expense of the alluvial fan. So should we try to stop the erosion on the alluvial fan, or should we wait a while and let it heal the valley bottom before we do that? Kind of a dilemma. We sometimes face those. Okay. We used various kinds of structures, but primarily what I call a zuni bowl, which is a drop structure made out of rocks. Craig Sponholz is in that machine. He built these structures. That was to stop the upstream migration of the head cut. This structure withstood that water coming down that valley 2.5 feet deep with no change. So we can build these structures so they work. One other kind of structure, and I'm running behind here, is what we call a plug and pond structure. And a plug and pond is built wide and shallow. It's not like your typical stock tank. And the idea is to spread the water across the land surface and there's no spillway. You connect it to the natural land surface as wide as possible. In this case, we put the plug and pond in an abandoned irrigation ditch, which is indicated by the yellow line, and the plug and pond is at the orange dot, and the water spreads out on the land, the former valley bottom, and it reclaimed 12 acres of former wet meadow. And we know it's reclaimed because the rabbit brush is dying and invaded upland plant species are being drowned out and native wetland species are moving in. I'm going to move ahead. This shows the before and after on that. And this is the pond. It's only 2 feet deep at deepest, and in 2 years it filled with sediment, so it's not a pond anymore. It's not a water source. It's the way to spread the water on the land surface. Here's the same thing on the Valles Caldera, which is a snowmelt-driven system rather than a monsoon-driven system. Another way to put water on the alluvial fan surface is with a worm ditch. And this one is on the Valle Vidal. There was a lot of cooperators on Seboya Canyon, and we still have additional cooperators. 13 years of working on it, and still counting. There's differences in the adaptability for adaptation on public lands versus private lands. The big opportunity is on public lands, the major pro, but the major pro on private lands is the dedication of the private landowner and the commitment to getting the work done. Maybe more flexibility. I want to remind everybody you have to have the proper permits before you start doing this kind of stuff. Okay, I wanted to show one treatment. I know my time's up. And this is on the Reardon Canyon Bonito Ranch. Here's another heresy type of a project. There's a stock tank there that was at a 25-foot high dam. It was had a 2-acre maximum surface area after a flood event, and you can see the dead vegetation where it gets drowned out. And then the new vegetation comes back. It's mostly weedy, 60-day maturity. And then there was a smaller area of a half an acre that regularly held water, and the water level didn't vary much up and down in that. That water level is being maintained with water stored in the floodplain upstream from it. And the difference between the half acre and the 2 acres is that pond water is temporary. It evaporates. The evaporation rate here is 7 feet a year. So that water was being lost to the system. The water needed for livestock is coming out of the meadow and being captured by the dam. So we deliberately lowered the dam and put the water back out on the meadow surface so that whenever the dam is full at that elevation indicated by the bathtub ring around the wall of the stock tank and confirmed by Google Earth photos, that water now goes to the to the meadow surface and grows vegetation. I'm going to skip through here and back up. That's the result of the many practices we've done on Reardon Ranch. So the lessons learned, Hubble Trading Post, things take time. It's still changing after 17 years and getting better. I couldn't visualize at that time the change. And we can impose a lot of treatments out there and not be really able to visualize the change. And there's acknowledgments, and let's think about what we're doing and seeing if we can cope with climate change and adapt to it. Thank you.